Hello and welcome to the new Hunting Dog Confidential podcast. I am your host and resident gun dog nerd, Craig Koshyk. In the first series of this podcast, my co-host Jennifer Wapensky and I produced over 30 episodes looking at all kinds of hunting dog types, from pointers to hounds, spitzes to spaniels, and just about everything in between. We took some deep dives into some rabbit holes and explored all aspects of the dogs and of the cultures that developed them. And I'm going to continue that exploration in this series. I'll also upload them to all of the regular podcast platforms that you're used to. So wherever you were getting this podcast before, that's where you'll find it now. But in addition to that, I'm going to upload them to YouTube. I want to do that because I want to add a little bit more visual content. Not this ugly mug in every frame, but things like photos and paintings and video clips, maps, and just things to help me explain some of the points I'm trying to make. And speaking of YouTube, I think this is the part where I'm supposed to sort of, point to the bottom and thumbs up or ask you to like something or smash the subscribe button, as the kids say these days. I don't know, I'm a boomer, so that's sort of beyond me. But whatever you're supposed to do with YouTube, whatever you're supposed to do with the podcast, subscribe, click, like, comment, you can do it now. All right, before we get into the very first episode, maybe I should take a minute or two just to introduce myself to any new listeners out there or new viewers of the YouTube channel, and to maybe reintroduce myself to those people that have been following along since the very first episode. Thanks for that, by the way. I think, first and foremost, what you need to know about me is that I'm a hunter. I'm from a long line of hunters. I live in central Canada with my wife, who's also a hunter, and our dogs, and yeah, they're hunters too, and they never let me forget it, because they're basically at my feet as I'm speaking right now, looking at me with those "we need to go hunting now" eyes. But, as a kid growing up here in Manitoba, I didn't actually have a hunting dog. We had a little black and white terrier for a while when I was very young, named Snoopy, of course. But, when my dad and uncles and cousins and I went hunting, basically I was the retriever on all of our duck hunts. Or I was the guy that, flushed the grouse for the others to shoot. But eventually I did get a dog. My wife and I, when we first met, we lived in Quebec and then moved around to Europe and back into Canada, into Quebec, but always in apartments and condos. So we never had a house or a yard to have a dog. But finally, I don't even think the ink was dry on the first mortgage we ever took out on a house with a yard and a fence before we got a dog. But we did. That was about almost 30 years ago now. And Felix was his name. He was a wonderful Weimaraner that I got from Hunting Lines. And it's really thanks to him that I became obsessed with hunting over bird dogs and obsessed with learning all I could about really all kinds of hunting dogs. I just wanted to learn more, not only about him, but about his breed, about where it came from, and about the people who developed it, and what, all of the different aspects of that breed were. And once I started digging into only the Weimaraners, that was my sort of, first attempt, was just to figure out, well, what is this breed? Where does it come from? Well, that just opened the door to all of the other continental breeds, and then all of the British and Irish breeds. So really, it's thanks to Felix that I started exploring other breeds and other types of hunting dogs now. And since my wife and I, we love nothing more than hunting with our dogs and traveling, we decided to, travel to go see other hunting dogs and to interview breeders and breed experts all over the place, and to take photographs of their dogs in action in their native lands, and to write about them. So I started writing articles, I started posting things online, I started contributing to various outlets, and started posting a lot of my photos and videos, and putting together notes for what would eventually become my first book, Pointing Dogs Volume 1, The Continentals, which at first I figured would take a year or two, which ended up taking a dozen years. I started in 1999 by first traveling to Austria to see the 75th anniversary celebration and test for the Austrian Weimaraner Club, and the book was published in 2011. After Lisa and I, my wife and I, had traveled to a dozen or so European countries, basically every country that's ever produced a pointing dog on the continent we visited, seen dogs there in action on the game that is local to that area. thanks to the wonderful people that invited us there to hunt over their dogs or to watch them in field trials or training situations or tests. We ended up seeing every one of the continental breeds that exist to this day in their native lands. I named it Volume 1 because I always had the intention of producing a second follow-up volume called Volume 2. And that's because I didn't include the pointers and setters. I didn't include the British and Irish breeds in the first book, because to do so would have been a huge undertaking. The first book, Pointing Dogs Volume 1, is over 400 or nearly 400 pages. If I added the British and Irish breeds, it would be easily over 800. So I divided it into 2 volumes and figured, like the first one, it'll take me a year or 2 to complete Volume 2. Well, nope. It took me another dozen years, and it was in 2023, just last year, that I finally released Volume 2, the British and Irish breeds. Currently, Volume 1 is out of print. It's completely sold out, which is an amazing thing, when you think about it. Starting off, I figured I'd sell half a dozen books, but we sold thousands. We do have plans to do a reprint and reissue a second edition of that particular book. My fingers are crossed for early 2025, so stay tuned to this platform and others. You will be the first to know. Volume 2, on the other hand, is available. You can order it if you're in the States, or if you're in Europe, you can order it through my friends at Project Upland. If you're in Canada, go to my website, which is dogwilling.ca, and navigate to the book part, and then you can order Volume 2 for yourself. So yeah, that's sort of the important bit that you need to know about me. I'm basically a gun dog nerd that loves hunting dogs and photographing them and writing about them and podcasting about them. But that's enough about me. Let's get on to the first episode of this new series. Let's talk about an idea. It's an idea that's commonly accepted as gospel in some hunting dog communities, but is usually more myth than fact when you actually think about it. It's the idea that the dogs we have today and the ways we hunt with them and train them and care for them are just the same as they've always been. We'll take a look at a dog breed and go, well, it's always been that way. Or we'll take a look at a technique we use in the field or a game that we hunt and figure, yeah, of course, it's my dad hunted him, my granddad did that, and his dad before him. Well, it's always been that way. And to be fair, there is some truth to the statement or to that idea. I mean, hunters today and their four-legged companions are in some ways just like hunters and their dogs were, 100 years ago or 500 years ago or 7,000 years ago, when the earliest known illustrations of hunters using dog to take quarry were carved into some sandstone cliffs in a place that is now in what we call today Saudi Arabia. But on the other hand, so much has changed over the years in the way we breed, train, and use our hunting dogs that almost everything about gun dogs and gun dog culture today is completely modern. So when we think that things have always been this way, the word always does a lot of heavy lifting, and it really only applies to maybe the last 100 years or so. If you go anywhere further back in time than, your granddad's generation or his granddad's generation, you will realize that things were completely different. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's start with, pointers. Today, it's one of the most popular bird dog breeds on the planet. I mean, they're the dominant breed in American all-age field trials, and they've always been that way, right? Well, not really. If you dig into the pointer's history, you'll discover that for a long time, pointers played a distant second fiddle to setters. In America, at least, and for decades there was little hope that they would ever catch up to setters. Or how about the versatile breeds? They're all really old, and the Germans, they always had a lot of those dogs, right? Well, no, not exactly. All those so-called old German breeds are actually modern creations, and there was a time not that long ago when there were no versatile dogs at all in Germany. No Weimaraners, no Münsterlanders, no GSPs, GWPs, none of them. Oh yeah, they had bird dogs. There were bird dogs there. But they weren't the versatiles we know today. They were pointers and setters and French braques and épagnols. In fact, one of the largest kennels of pointers and setters in the entire world in the late 1800s wasn't in England or America. It was right smack dab in the middle of Germany, run by a German prince. So let's go back to the first example I gave, the one about pointers being the most popular bird dog in the American all-age field trial scene today, but a distant second to setters way back when. What's the deal? How did that happen? Well, to answer that question, we gotta fire up the time machine and set the dials to take us to a tiny town called Grand Junction in the great state of Tennessee in the year 1909. As soon as we arrive, we make our way to the hotel lobby near the train station. It's the night before the start of the national championship in January, so the place is packed with men and filled with cigar smoke. There's judges, owners, handlers, and field trial organizers all there, and I'm sure the liquor was flowing. The conversation is loud and animated. You could barely hear the piano player in the corner. Then, suddenly, an altercation breaks out, and two setter owners nearly come to blows as they argue over who has the better dog. Then, out of nowhere, a broad-shouldered, barrel-chested man walks up between the two of them and says in a calm, steady voice, "Settle down, boys. I'll wager that neither of your dogs will even place tomorrow. In fact, I'll wager that a pointer is going to win the stake." You could just imagine the hoots and hollers just erupting. A pointer had never won the national championship, and all the best setters in the country were there to compete. I mean, the short-haired dogs didn't stand a chance in the view of everyone there, except the guy making the bet. Unfazed, he doubled down. He said, "I'll wager $5,000, which today is the equivalent of nearly 200,000. I'll wager $5,000 in your own good old United States money." The room falls silent. Everyone just stares at the guy. I'm sure they were just all gobsmacked. They must have thought him insane. In an article written after the trial, Albert Hochtwald wrote that the man, quote, "pulled out a roll of greenbacks large enough to choke an elephant and began peeling off $100 bills until the eyes of some of the would-be bettors bulged from their sockets. But no one wanted to wager." The man who stunned the crowd with his offer of a $5,000 bet was a well-known figure on the field trial and dog show scene. He'd traveled all the way to Grand Junction, Tennessee from right here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. His name was Thomas Johnson, and with him on that nearly 2,000-mile journey by train was a dog named Manitoba Rap. The final brace was made up of two pointers, and during that 3-hour heat, they both put on spectacular performances. But in the end, the judges declared Thomas Johnson's dog, a pointer, the winner. Hochwald wrote, quote, "A pointer has won the national championship of 1909, and Manitoba Rap, the game little dog belonging to Thomas Johnson, is responsible for carrying the Shorthairs to victory in the greatest event that the field trial world has to bestow. Since the national championship has been in existence, this is the first time that the stake has been won by a pointer. So it may be said that the race of 1909 marks an epoch in this classic event." In the years that followed, setters won the crown several more times, but by the 1920s, pointers were winning more often than setters. And then, from about the 1930s till today, 99% of the time, the winning dog at the end of the national championship trial has been a pointer. So what happened? How did pointers go from a distant second in America to being the undisputed all-age champion breed today? Well, the answer lies, at least in part, in how hunters in North America used to use their gun dogs. You see, in contrast to their counterparts in Britain and elsewhere, Americans have kind of always expected that their bird dogs should retrieve. In the past, setters in particular were considered natural retrievers and were in fact often the preferred choice of some of these market hunters who made their living by selling, the waterfowl that they bagged. When it came to pointers, though, many thought that they just lacked the natural desire to retrieve. And even if they did want to retrieve, or even if you tried to train them to retrieve, people thought that pointers were simply too thin-skinned to retrieve from the thick kind of cover that they were used to in the States. Charles Halleck, for for example, even went so far as to state that if a pointer did show a strong interest to retrieve, it must have been, because there was setter in its background. And so when field trials were first organized in America, in a lot of the trials, the rules required that the dogs should retrieve any and all birds shot for them, even if they fell in water. You see, back in the day, the handlers weren't on horseback. They handled their dogs on foot, and they handled a shotgun for that dog. Some of them would occasionally employ a gunner for them, but for the most part, it was the handler handling the dog and the gun. And when the birds were flushed, it was the handler who shot, and it was his dog that was supposed to go and retrieve. So if you had pointers, you probably didn't train them to retrieve because you probably thought they didn't retrieve very well. You probably had setters because that would give you sort of a winning edge or the edge in a field trial, because a field trial that required retrieving, well, you automatically thought setter. So at first, the vast majority of dogs running in trials were setters, and the reason was it was tough cover and the dogs had to retrieve, and pointers were simply thought of as not being suitable to that. Now, that is not to say that there were no pointers running in some of those early trials. There were a few, not many, but a few. And in fact, in some trials, pointers and setters were run separately. Setters ran against setters in stakes that you had to retrieve, and pointers were running against pointers in stakes where, retrieving wasn't required or was at least optional. But over time, organizers of field trials, trainers, and handlers started to realize that if we're going to judge dogs on their natural bird finding and bird handling abilities, we don't really need to see how well they retrieve, because let's face it, we can kind of train any dog, even if it doesn't want to retrieve, we can force break it to retrieve. So at the end of the day, we might be seeing setters and pointers with natural desire to retrieve, or we might just see the effects of a really, really good trainer. And, some of these trainers are so good you'd never know the difference between a natural retrieve and a forced retrieve. So let's just go ahead and drop the retrieving requirement in these trials. And let's start running pointers against setters and setters against pointers and judge them only on their bird handling and, bird finding abilities. And forget about this retrieving stuff. So that was one of the first steps that allowed pointers to, get a little bit closer to setters. But that attitude of pointers being too thin-skinned to retrieve from water or to go into the really thorny thickets or tough cover, that lingered for a while, because even though the retrieving element was dropped, people still looked at pointers as being, a little more delicate than setters. They just weren't as hardy as setters or as tough as setters. Yeah, it's hard to imagine today that attitude, because a lot of the pointers out there now are like as tough as nails. There is no tougher dog on the planet than some of these, rock-ribbed pointers that we're breeding today. But back in the day, they were seen as susceptible to the cold, for example, because a lot of the hunting that was done at the time and some of the trials were run in, places that had colder weather. So people just had this attitude that setters were somehow tougher than pointers. A lot of people also thought that setters were faster, that they were bigger running, that they were more elegant. And these were some things that pointer breeders had to address. They had to start breeding faster dogs, bigger running dogs, and tougher dogs, or at least dogs that appear to be tougher. And they started doing that. And as soon as they did, as soon as they got a little more speed, as soon as they got a little bit more, range in some of their dogs, they started finding the winner's circle a little more often at some of the trials. However, for a long time, even those improvements didn't make much of a difference. Sure, pointer breeders were breeding bigger running, tougher, faster dogs, but they were running them under judges who simply preferred the setter's look, its style, its way of hunting, and its way of working birds. Setters had become so ingrained into the psyche and into the identity of the American field trial scene and American hunting scene that awarding any dog that didn't look or hunt or work like a setter just didn't feel right to a lot of the judges. In his book, Modern Training and Handling, Walter Waters wrote, quote, Pointers had everything the setters dared to claim, and so much so that I believe the work of the field trial pointer on birds, his wonderful nose, and the excellence on birds has done more to educate the public away from its insane clamor for speed above everything else, and turn their eyes towards the admiration of classy bird dog work. It took some of the judges a long time to reconcile themselves to the fact that meritorious, snappy bird work could be accomplished without all that fussy dash that is the heritage of the setter of today. And there was still one more factor that sort of held pointers back, but it had nothing to do with their performance or their abilities in the field. It was purely cosmetic, and it was strange because back in the day, they didn't believe the old adage that says a good dog can never be a bad color. For some reason, at the time, people didn't like black in the coat of a pointer. And even though a number of pointers with solid black coats had been imported from England, and black and white pointers in general were not uncommon in the US at the time, it was almost impossible to convince a judge to award a dog with black in its coat a win at a trial. That is until about 1892, when a black and white pointer named Rip Rap came along. He made history in a trial that C.B. Whitford called the strongest setter year we have ever known. Everett Skehan wrote that Rip Rap's victory sent the spirits of pointer enthusiasts skyrocketing when he delivered his finest race and easily bested the field to become the first pointer in the United States ever to capture any kind of championship. In fact, Rip Rap's win was so impressive that people soon started calling any pointer with a black and white coat a Rip Rap. So we can say that from about the early 1890s onward, pointers started to make huge strides in catching up to the setters. Setters, of course, would remain the dominant breed for several more decades, but every year there were more and more pointers at trials, and every year there were more judges open-minded enough to give them the win, even if they had a black and white coat. And since then, it's been almost all pointers all the time. Well, there you have it, folks. Episode number 1 of the new Hunting Dog Confidential podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did and you want to support our efforts, the best way to do so, and it's free, is just to leave a review or a rating on the podcast platform of your choice or on our YouTube channel. And if you're interested in purchasing a copy of my latest book, Pointing Dogs Volume 2, The British and Irish Breeds, you can get it at Project Upland if you're in the US or internationally, or if you're in Canada, you can go to my website, dogwilling.ca.